Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. We're 2 videos away from concluding our series about Brian Epstein from the book The Man Who Made the Beatles. I still can't believe we are soon coming to the end of the story. I'm so glad I decided to do videos on this book because we have a full picture of just how Brian got the idea of being a manager to the Beatles, and we got to learn more about Brian the man, the manager, the son, and the friend. So let's see what's happening today. While Brian was recovering at the Priory, he had trouble sleeping. His moods would dip and swing. He would go from total control of his business and quick to tear-up sentimentality. His instincts, commercial acumen, and enthusiasm for music never deserted him. He had told George Martin that he was slightly concerned that the Beatles might be slipping in popularity on records, and that got the Beatles moving, and they went into the studio, making Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. He asked the office to deliver to him at Priory a list of his artist positions on the American best-selling record charts. When a member of the office brought the list with only the Beatles on it, he was mad and said, "What about the other artist?" Brian said, "If you were interested in music and our artist, you would have wanted to know. You're fired." And Brian was elated when a bouquet of flowers arrived from John Lennon with a get well card that the Beatles signed. "You know we love you, and I really mean it. Love, John." Weiss, who was with Brian, said the gift brought him to tears. Weiss said he had to go back to New York for a quick trip, and Brian panicked. He asked Nat to stay at Chapel Street until he was released from the nursing home. So Weiss stayed in England long enough to attend a party that only Epstein could have masterminded. Part of Brian's therapy, once he left Priory, he made more use of his country home in Sussex. He had a housewarming event at Kingsley Hill 3 days later. Brian greeted the 3 Beatles and their wives at the door with beaming pride of a proud father welcoming them into his home. Brian was sad that Paul couldn't be there because he liked all 4 Beatles in the same room. It made him happy, and he was emotionally upset at Paul's absence, but he went ahead and had the party. Brian had LSD and marijuana, which was given when the guests entered the door. And George Harrison spoke to Brian and said that Brian was on the verge of a possible realization which might have brought him to another level. He showed a healthy interest in George's enthusiasm for Indian cultures. Brian was with his closest friends Lionel Bart, John Pritchard, disc jockey Kenny Everett, Nat Weiss, Mick Jagger, Marianne Faithfull, and Robert Stigwood. And Brian even had Derek Taylor and his wife fly in from California. Taylor remembers taking LSD at the party and then led a sing-along at the grand piano. It was a role that Brian had wanted Paul to take if he had been there. Paul told his guests Paul should have come. He knew it meant a lot to me, he said. The day after the party, Rolling Stones' Brian Jones, a special friend of Brian's, arrived with Georgie fame. With Nat Weiss and the others, Brian drove them to a rural setting for lunch. At the coffee stage, Brian offered Nat a sugar cube. And Weiss remembered saying, "No, I don't need the sugar in my coffee, Brian." Weiss knew it was LSD. He said, "I've never taken acid, and I didn't want to start there." Brian smiled, and they talked about Brian's excesses. Later, Brian drove Nat to the railway station to get a train for London. And Brian noticed that Nat had an ordinary ticket, so he took it back to the booking office and changed it to a first-class ticket. Brian believed sincerely in flower power, of love and peace and bells. He often dressed in psychedelically patterned shirt and frequently referred to his friends in letters as beautiful people. He felt this way before flower power came to be. When he was in the Army, he talked of being a conscientious objector. He had always evangelized for world peace. Brian agreed with the hippie dream, but in business he disagreed. He was a budget-conscious Liverpool shopkeeper deep inside, and he maintained that to be able to indulge, to buy good dope, one had to make a profit at work and ensure that the business was on a financially sound footing. Brian had made some mistakes. None had occurred in the embryonic Liverpool, where he ran a tight ship. The need for stability in the free-spinning entertainment world was lost on the Beatles. They were intoxicated by wealth, largesse, and unworkable ideals. They were busy planning a financially suicidal venture outside Epstein's direct orbit, and Paul was the driving force. They decided to launch their own company and call it Apple. The name symbolized to Paul starting afresh. A is for Apple. It's going to be a new era for the Beatles. Joanne Newfield, Brian's secretary, said that Paul was the one who conceived Apple, and he was the Beatle who gave Brian the most worry. Paul was the one who would get on the phone and create, and Brian had to explain and battle longer with him. On social occasions, they were fine together, but whenever there was a worry from the Beatles, it always came from Paul. Apple was highly indicative of how difficult it was for Brian to cope with Paul at times. The Beatles defied Brian's instincts and judgment, but with the help of Brian's lawyer and accountant, the Beatles registered Apple Music Limited on May 25, 1967. After Brian's death, the company changed its name on December 4, 1967 to Beatles Limited. The company remains active as of the date the book was published, which was 1989. John Lennon wasn't too sure about Paul's plans. He sided with Brian in that way. He saw the pitfalls, and Joanne said that John had dreadful misgivings about Apple. Brian believed Apple would be the Beatles' folly. How absurd, he told friends, that the Beatles, who had wisely steered him away from their music making since their earliest days together, should now believe they had sound business sense. As evolving musicians on the threshold of an exciting, innovative, and important era in pop, they should continue to be artists, he firmly believed, and leave the administration to experts. The Beatles, they had another idea that worried Brian. It was their idea to buy a Greek island for $100,000 and to develop it into an idyllic home for the Beatles, their families, and friends. As John and George went off to research it, Brian wrote to Nat Weiss, "A dotty idea, but they're no longer children." 2 months after Brian's country home party, Brian improved mentally and physically, and he worried less about work. Jeffrey Ellis casually mentioned that he was planning to visit the opera at Glenbourne with William Cavendish. He was personal assistant to Sir Joseph Lockwood. Brian said the place was only 15 minutes from his Kingsley Hill home, where he was spending the weekend alone. He said, "It's ridiculous driving all the way back to London after the performance. You must both spend the night at Kingsley Hill. And what are you doing about eating?" Brian was warming up to playing host. He arranged to meet them at the interval, and Epstein arrived in his Rolls-Royce. To Ellis's astonishment, in the trunk was a magnificent champagne picnic that his housekeeper prepared. Epstein took delight in presenting and cleaning up afterward, leaving his two friends to re-enter the opera and join him that night at his house. To Jeffrey, it signaled the re-emergence of the Brian he had known years before, full of similarly thoughtful gestures. It was during this time Paul had an interview with Life magazine, and he admitted he had taken LSD. The story was seized by the British Sunday papers and splashed across their front pages on June 18, 1967, Paul's 25th birthday. Paul phoned Brian at Kingsley Hill the night before, saying that he had told a journalist he had sampled the drug. Brian had a sleepless night and worried throughout Sunday about the ramifications. Brian drove back to London on Monday, knowing he would be asked to commit. Brian said, "I finally decided to admit I had taken LSD as well. There were several reasons for this. One was certainly to make things easier for Paul. People don't particularly enjoy being lone wolves, and I didn't feel like being dishonest and covering up, especially as I believe that an awful lot of good has come from hallucinatory drugs. People tend to think of San Francisco hippies as dirty and unhappy, but in fact they're doing rather better things than the people who lead our nation." Brian added, though, that neither Paul or he advocated the general use of LSD, so he intended, he added, to warn people as well as to own up. They also wanted to help the cause of the Rolling Stones, he declared. It is particularly unfortunate that they should have been scapegoats. Brian said his own decision to sample LSD was made because I heard a lot of good about it, and I had sufficient understanding of it to know what I was doing. I had also read a lot about it. He took it after the Beatles had tried it. We're a closely knit circle, and we influence each other. He emphasized he didn't turn on at first because he felt the need for drugs. It was an experiment. The Beatles could always handle themselves with the media, but Brian was thinking of his other artists who would be exposed by his personal LSD admission. That Monday, he took Scylla to lunch at Les Ambassadeurs in Park Lane. The purpose of the meeting, he told her, was to clear the air over Paul's admission that he had taken LSD and pot. "I want you to know before the news is published that I have taken it as well," Brian told Scylla. And Scylla remembered later she went berserk. "You're my manager. How could you be so irresponsible? They'll think I'm taking pot now, and you tell me not to smoke on television, jukebox jury." Epstein said he thought Scylla would like to know what he was saying so that she could alert her mother and tell her not to worry about her. Brian used all his persuasive powers to calm down a girl who distanced herself from the unreal world that Brian and the Beatles had entered. Nat Weiss remembered Brian's behavior due to the drug use at his New York apartment. Brian was witty and very engaging, very charming, but if he smoked a joint or two, he'd take all the furniture and move it in the center of the room and pile it up in one heap, almost like a tombstone. We'd talk all night, and then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he'd go into the kitchen and bake a cake. Brian slept little, only about 2 hours a night. I was amazed when I'd get up in the morning, said Weiss. I could hardly see straight, but there would be Brian making notes of what was to be done in the day. And Brian's suits had specially made inside pockets that contained amphetamines. I saw him taking Dexedrine. They were not illegal, but an accepted medication for people like students who had exams and people who had a lot of work to do. They're now prohibited because people abuse them. They were normal medication for anyone overweight, and I used them. They suppress your appetite, and they keep you up awake, and you couldn't seek oblivion, said Weiss. Brian used to have all the people I know roll all his joints, 20 or 30, because Brian couldn't roll a joint. He was the least mechanical human being I've ever known. At Weiss's apartment building, when he stepped into the elevator, Brian often accidentally pushed the alarm button instead of the floor button. Nat never saw his friend with circles under his eyes, not wasted or anything like that. He was always up, but he wasn't speedy. He was taking all these pills, and it wasn't until I saw that I imagined why this man slept so little. He had enormous energy, and when he wanted relaxing, the pot did it. The habitual drinking was replaced by marijuana. Brian occasionally drank vodka, but I never saw him drunk, said Weiss. He was fascinated with trying things, but he wasn't dependent on them. Brian tried acid because he thought it would give him further insights, and then he finally came to the conclusion that acid wasn't the answer. He thought it would widen his scope and comprehension, and there was a fascination with the glamour of something serendipitous. He was never addicted or attached to anything. If the downers took hold of him, it was only to come back from the cumulative effect of all those amphetamines so he could rest. Because he'd gotten to the point where he never slept, and consequently, he found himself on this terrible seesaw of uppers and downers. So one was combating the other, and it began to take a toll on him physically. He was not manic-depressive, but there was a psychological thing. There were times he would just fall into depression, but it was indigenous to him. Brian was not a guy who made heavy use of lithium and mood elevators, things like that. They could have kept the balance in his chemistry, but he had strange fascinations. What made him great destroyed him. Brian's next move was to appoint a manager for himself. The more he thought about it, the more logical and practical it seemed. Nat Weiss was an obvious choice since Brian wanted to continue his activities in America. Epstein told Weiss a month before he died, "And you'll become the manager's manager." Weiss was enthused to get to work immediately. He wanted Brian to host a television program for the Canadian Broadcasting Company, which would pay for his trip to the States, September the 2nd, 1967. There would be a much-needed holiday in the Hamptons and some meetings in New York to raise Epstein's profile. Then Nat would take Brian on to California to discuss a film and other possibilities. This was to be the grand trip that Brian relished. Nat said, "I had everything planned for a month's stay, setting up this whole new career. It was the selling of Brian Epstein, and it was to be a lot of fun. And Brian was so up about it, he couldn't wait to get here. Unfortunately, it never happened. During that time, Epstein and Weiss had thought of getting Harry Nilsson to join Emperor, and Nilsson was beginning a close friendship with John Lennon and George Harrison. Epstein was anxious to meet him and strike a business venture during that proposed U.S. visit. It would have been the second signing to an emperor for Weiss and Epstein and a creative coup. So I'm going to stop the video here. We're one video away before the end of the series, and I really have been very interested in the whole book. It's taken us down a lot of different roads, and we get to see sides of Brian that we didn't know about. You know, we just saw him on the sidelines with the Beatles and briefly talking to the press, but we never got to see the man himself. Well, the book has made us see Brian the man, and it's been a really enjoyable book to read. So I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And I hope that everybody's been having a good day. Tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you.